I've only gone in
There are
the,
probably as many people.
Start. Thank you so much.
Okay, they're gonna come back. Recording.
Yes.
We would like to welcome everyone to our February 2024 Cottonwood Heights Planning Commission work session. We have a couple items to go through. I'm really excited about this. We're going to get an update on the town center in this work session, and during our business session, we have again, we pick these up because staff is dutifully trying to continually clean up our code wherever possible. So I hope you've had a chance to look over the items that they've revised. It's a kind of a miscellaneous assortment, but the level of housekeeping, even on the ADUs and some things that are fairly recent, that I'm interested and curious to see how much discussion it generates with this group and potentially with the public. So we'll turn it over to staff for presentations on the town center, and then we'll go through the business item that we have for the business meeting.
Can I suggest we go the other way?
Oh, you want to do it the other way?
Cover the text amendment first and then
Great.
what time is left.
That sounds great. I completely appreciate that.
Okay, well, this one's pretty short. We only did 5 on this run. Some of the more recent ones were more like 11, 12, I think, and we figured we'd keep it kind of short. So should leave you guys with plenty of time to discuss town center. I'll run us through the first 2 of the changes, and then Ian will run us through the next 3. I think I might just zoom a little bit more. See if it'll catch up. There we go. Okay.
much appreciated.
Yeah, if you need me to zoom in anymore too, I can. It's just a little delayed from when I click to when it goes. Okay, the first change is to something called public utility easements. These are often abbreviated as PUEs on a subdivision plat. So if you've seen a subdivision plat or work with them, you've probably encountered these. It's basically a kind of invisible perimeter along the lot lines, just set in a certain number of feet from each property line that's meant to serve as ongoing access for public utility companies to, have access or access infrastructure on the lot. It's just a very standard part of subdivisions. You see them city to city. It's not a thing unique to Cottonwood Heights. We have had a kind of plat template that is specified the dimensions for public utility easements, but it's not in our code. And as you know, most development in Cottonwood Heights is existing, so it doesn't come up too often, but when we do get a new subdivision plat, we are asked, what are the public utility easement requirements? So we thought it was going to be best practice to codify those, so it's not just a document we're giving out, but it's actually in our code. So we've proposed doing that through adding a really small section to our subdivision ordinance, which is Title 12 in the code. Again, this doesn't have any change from how we already do it. It just puts it in the code. So These dimensions we've put here are pretty standard for plats in Cottonwood Heights, as well as what I've seen in other cities. But yeah, that's this first proposed change. Are there any questions from the commission on this one? Okay. And then my second one is a proposed change for signage for religious institutions. So monument signs are, pretty ubiquitous with commercial development. They're in front of most commercial businesses. We see them also at institutional organizations like schools and at churches even. But a lot of churches exist in residential zoning. The residential zones in Cottonwood Heights allow churches. And so we do see that. And the current sign code doesn't allow monument signs in residential zones. So we've run into some religious institutions in Cottonwood Heights wanting to do a sign to show what denomination they're affiliated with and put their information out there, but because of their zoning, it isn't permitted. So we felt it was appropriate to make a small amendment to the signage code to specify that monument signs are allowed in these zones, which they already are, and at church, rectory, or temple. That's the way our code currently defines a religious institution. In terms of
Wait, I
sizes-
do have a.
Oh, sure, yeah, go for it.
On that number 7, at a church, rectory, or temple, I looked for definition elsewhere, because I felt like that was kind of not all inclusive.
Sure.
Because we've got synagogues,
Oh,
the
sure.
Muslim community center, I mean, those kinds
Yeah,
of
that's a good
things.
point.
So if it is, I'm sorry if I missed where it's defined, is there a more broad way we could say at a religious institution or place of worship or something like that instead of, because these are kind of, they're kind of specific.
Yeah, that's a great point. The definition in our code is for church, rectory, or temple. So we
Okay,
just listed it that way, but while we're making the edit, it wouldn't be any more difficult to just do a definition for religious institution or place of worship. That's not a problem at all. So
okay,
that's a change you guys can make in a motion and we can include that. It isn't an issue to make that
Okay.
more inclusive.
Are those allowed in residential zonings as well?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess if there's a home church, residential zoning, they'll be allowed to have a signage in their front yard in the residential zoning?
So for home businesses, it's a separate situation. They're limited just to a nameplate. So that
So
wouldn't
it wouldn't be a home business, it'd be like a home church. Place of worship, which I believe, those are pretty prevalent in downtown Salt Lake, kind of all across the county. So I don't know if that is something that we would want to have in place in a residential zoning component, just because if there was a home church that is qualified under a 501c3, we might want to just be conscious of that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not aware of any in Cottonwood Heights currently, but I could be wrong and it's probably good to anticipate could get some in the future. So
So when you use that term, and just because I don't not heard it before, are we talking about a home that has been converted to a sole purpose of a church? What is?
I'm not
legal
familiar
Is
with
definition?
it
that where
either,
the
so-
primary, it's
Yeah,
a home,
absolutely.
the primary use is a,
But do they
Absolute church.
still live there? Like, is it a residence as well? Or-
Yeah, so it would be
Okay.
both. So I don't know if that's permitted
So, yeah.
within.
one thing I can touch on is if someone wanted to say, I don't want to use this as a house anymore, it's 100% a place of worship. That's allowed, it's an allowed use, but it is a conditional use.
Okay,
But the answer is yes, I guess if that got approved in a house rather than in a larger church building that we're used to, this would apply to that.
But
But are
if it were still used as a dwelling also with the church,
It were primarily a home and secondarily a church, I think that would fall under the home business.
yeah, that's what I was
so
getting
that'd
at.
be home business.
Which would also be conditional use.
correct.
Yeah,
How would it be home business?
and it wouldn't be allowed.
Because it would be a
monument.
nonprofit.
It's about the primary use of the property. If the primary use of the property is, 6 days a week, it's a home and someone lives there, and then 1 day a week, it's a place of worship or 2 or whatever. The primary use is the residence, the secondary use is the business.
because it's not really a
But
business.
the question is it a
Religious
business?
operation.
I don't think it's a business per se, but I think what we're getting at is we would put it under the same regulations as this is first and foremost a home. And so if you want to do signage for this other use, we would say, okay, it's the same thing as if you had a home business. You can have a nameplate sign.
Yeah, I think just from a church, just because of the criteria that we're qualifying under church. None of the churches I know that are home churches in Salt Lake have any signage,
Sure.
but they are also qualified as home churches. So I think we would probably want to have some type of a discernment between commercial use or commercial zoning and residential so that we don't have big plaques of home churches stacked in neighborhoods. That's more so. my
Yeah,
thought
you
process.
can still in a residential zone have like a full LDS ward house that can exist in a residential zone. So that would
Okay.
allow to have a monument sign today. If you want to call out a separate provision for home churches where it's still a dwelling with a place of worship use, you could do that. But what this is getting at is saying full blown 100% no dwelling involved churches are allowed in residential zones today. Like we have, most LDS ward houses are zoned R18 single family.
Mhm.
So this would be allowing those places of worship to have signage. If you want to do separate standards for signage for a home church, feel free to add that in.
We don't have a zone that's religious institution. We have a land use, but not a zone. So most of the churches in the city are in R18, single family residential zones.
And I don't anticipate it being an issue. I just know that, Salt Lake specifically has had dispersed churches coming throughout, so.
Yeah, if you want to add standards, I think it's always good to be more clear.
So are we saying that if someone's home, they also run a church
Mhm.
out of it also? So it's no longer a religious institute, it's not a religious, it's a home with a church.
Right.
It's not, so I think that wouldn't qualify for a monument.
You could consider saying on 7 here, a church, however you define it, a place of worship, except places of worship in a home or
I think we
auxiliary
need to be-
to a dwelling.
I don't think that we should have the monument for those that are in,
No,
stacked in,
exactly.
they just,
But I don't know how you could you'd have to add something to this language.
correct.
Or
Because
we could put it in
And
definition.
other places in the code.
if I say it's a place of worship, then it seems like I might.
Well, and maybe it doesn't
Pass
need
that
to
down.
say
Yeah.
where the primary use
Yeah,
is,
you could do that.
is a place of worship and then you're.
Or you could phrase it as like accepting those where the primary function is as a dwelling. However you want to do it. I think that's totally good.
I think that, you had used the term, 5013C, right? Like if it has a license to operate that way, right? Or some sort of entity, that's different, right, than Bible study. And so it feels like if we're gonna start to define it, it should be clear and concise about where the rules lie.
So, I mean, for
Suggestion?
example, St. Thomas More, the pastor there lives on site, so would that disqualify because it is a primary residence, but then also has?
I would
And
say no, because the primary function of that property is as a chapel, as a place of worship. The dwelling quarters is like very, very secondary in size.
I think just with kind of the progress, we should probably have just
Yeah, you guys
some way
can
to.
certainly
I
add
mean,
that
you
in.
could have properties at which the primary use is a religious institution.
Does
That's
that
great.
solve it? Do you feel?
I think so, yeah.
Primary use, I think that's a good clarification.
Cool, yeah, you guys can definitely include that. Looking a little bit at
Sean,
the,
will you make sure that you've got the verbiage to add that one, or do you, staff, you wanna propose it that way when you have a?
yeah, I usually, when you guys make edits, just kind of recap them in the business meeting.
Okay.
But if you have specific verbiage you want to write down, that makes it even easier. Looking a little bit at the size, this is the table that's currently in our code that breaks down size. Let me zoom in just a smidge here. Okay, so let me walk you through the changes. First, let's talk about the one that we've been talking about, which is religious institutions, and then I'll recap a few other changes I made while we were in here. So we've talked about changing this to be a broader definition of places of worship or religious institutions, so we can make that update in how it's listed. But we basically just added a row to the table for that, and then the size that I've proposed doing is just the smallest size currently allowed by code. So you can see that the size of monument signs varies a lot in the different zones. The residential office zone has a maximum of 32 square feet, 4 feet in height. So I, suggest just using that smallest metric there, but if you have a different thought in mind.
How does that square footage compare to the average sign across the street?
That's kind of a tough question because they all do vary. I could pull the plans if you want to see from one of the recent ones. If you look at like what's allowed in public facilities like at Brighton, that would be a PF zone probably. And you can see those are, for their electronic one, 64 square feet would be their maximum. I'm not sure what they built, but it's much larger in those zones. The
Yeah.
36 square feet is kind of what you see in commercial zones. So 32 isn't too much under that, but just kind of would keep it a little bit less obtrusive probably, so.
I'm just wondering if existing signs in residential areas would
Be made
exceed that
non-conforming.
and have to be non-conforming.
I think
Honestly,
they already are non-conforming, because they're not allowed by code today. So they're, I mean,
honestly, I would also say we don't have a ton, so.
So now and I don't know if this would be covered anywhere, you know, you talked about the electronic signs. Are those explicitly disqualified?
Correct, yeah, so there's a separate section called PFEDs, public facility electronic display sign, and OPEDs, off-premise electronic display signs, and it specifically calls out where those are allowed. They are not allowed elsewhere, so if somebody applies for a digital sign, electronic monument sign at their commercial business in the CR zone, to say, sorry, that's not allowed. There are exceptions for like time and temperature signs. I think we talked about that a little bit in a past code update, but yeah, this is where it's explicitly saying, okay, public facilities, you can have that electronic one.
I don't think we need to talk about this right now, but it's come to my attention in the last year or so that electronic signs are kind of are improving in terms of their brightness and their utility, and we kind of think of like the neon signs and Vegas style stuff of our you know yesteryear, and there may be an opportunity at a certain point. I don't think it's now, but I would just put a pin in that at some point. Let's consider that, because I think there are way more acceptable uses that are different than what our experience was at the mouth of the canyon, where it felt like they turned the brightness up and we had to come up with all these guardrails, and there's a little more, there may be some versions that are palatable.
Well, it's great to hear. It's always nice when technology improves. Okay, let me recap really quick the other changes we made. So curiously, the RO zone was missing from the table, but it allows monument signs, so we just added it there to be more clear. And then another change, the CR zone only had a line item for a group monument, which would be like when you have a bunch of different stores and they share a monument sign and they have different sections of it. But of course, not every business in the CR zone wants a group monument sign. A lot of them just want their own. And so this has long been kind of a point of confusion where we've been like, oh, the table only lists group monument, but you're not a group monument. What do we do? So we just added a line for the single monument. That would be if it's just one business, and used the same dimension as in the neighborhood commercial zone there. And then the last change we made was, or I made, was just changing the signable area to be size. I believe that was the intention of this column. So signable area is defined in the sign code as the area with the content. So that would just be like the perimeter around the words and logo. I think this is getting at more the size of the actual obstruction. So I am suggesting we make that clear here. And this is how this ordinance, since I've been in the city, has been implemented. It just wasn't consistent with the definition. So anyway, those are the changes we're proposing at this time. Did anyone have questions or comments on the table?
I do have a question. It has to
Sure.
do with the CR the items that you just talked about.
Yeah,
So, you know, if we say there's there's several kind of medical office buildings on Highland. Usually have a group sign. Say there's a group sign, and then as tenants turn over, they're like, we don't like your sign. We're gonna keep putting signs. So like, does your sidewalk become sign? And I might be classifying that business incorrectly. I can think of some across 23rd
sure.
East as well, where I don't know. I mean, I would imagine that was kind of the reason, is like one sign, a
Yeah,
commercial area. But I mean, are there any concerns about the difference? Like it looks like political season and we've got their stake in the
Having
ground.
multiple, having a sign for every business, possibly, I mean, is
If there's
that?
no-
Not only that, but can you get
Street
both?
frontage.
Can you get both a group monument and an individual monument?
Yeah, I think Mike just pulled up the passage that
So,
may
yeah,
help.
monument signs, it says where permitted, and then immediately after, the premises may display one monument sign on each street or highway on which it has frontage in the following zoning districts.
So, sorry, did you say that was the property? So
Yeah.
anybody-
So a site, yeah. a
Okay.
Development
So you
project.
can have the group monument and the individual ones, but
You can
if
choose.
you have a bunch of businesses and they're their own property, they could each have a sign. Which of course in actuality is, I think, realistic, because they don't always want to do like a group sign with
Mhm.
other random businesses. But I think this would prevent them from double dipping and saying, we have this big group one and then we're doing individual.
There's additional clarification. A shopping center may display one monument sign at each exit and entrance, subject to group monument requirements. Occupants within a shopping center may not display monument signs individually. And then multi-use buildings, again, may have one monument sign facing each street or highway on which the building has frontage.
Okay. So that would preclude the use of both types, period.
Right. Mhm.
I've got one more question before
yeah.
we move off the table. So, did you guys address pole signs at all with this?
Pole signs are prohibited in code. There's no changes made
Okay.
by this update.
Or anything that we're doing to handle the pole signs that exist already?
So it would fall under the legal non-conforming uses, so they are allowed to keep that and make maintenance modifications to it. If the site is vacated for, I think, upwards of 1 year, they lose their vested status and have to demolish it. So we've had that happen a couple times with those really big pole signs where it's used, site goes vacant, sits vacant, new person buys it, we say, sorry, use it or lose it, you need to replace it. So that's the
Yeah.
process now with that allowance.
Are we seeing anything in other cities similar size or that are, forward thinking where there are guardrails we can put around pole signs that would make them more palatable, or are we just help me understand the history of that?
I think historically pole signs are those that are really tall and kind of obstruct skylines and views, kind of have an outdated feel, reminiscent maybe of highway style development.
Got it.
In the form-based code, we have distinguished that separate from what might be considered a traditional pole sign, there can be more pedestrian scale wayfinding signage that is
Yeah.
technically on a pole.
Yeah.
So one example we saw at a conference in Philadelphia is the city of Philadelphia has these great historic markers throughout the city that are by definition a pole sign, but they are at such a scale that a short person such as myself can read them. So we have tried to build in some allowances for maybe what technically is a pole sign, but isn't actually one. As far as the more commercial scale, it's largely considered best practice to move away from those. So, I mean, it's up to probably each city, but for the ones we do have, they are allowed to stay until the use changes.
What guardrails do we have for billboards in residential or mixed use?
So billboards are not allowed in Cottonwood Heights unless they're existing. No new billboards can be built. By state code, billboard companies have rights to relocate an existing billboard within a certain number of linear feet. So we have to abide by that regulation, but no new billboards can be built.
So the one on Wasatch Boulevard we have no control over that because it's,
What's there is there.
Yeah.
Certainly, I guess that things change and maybe over time property owners decide to renegotiate the contract, but the ones that are there are allowed to stay and be relocated within a certain number of feet.
yeah, I don't know that I have all the answers on signage, but I noticed Brighton's new fancy lift up there is basically bedazzled with this fantastic electronic sign. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but they got the volume turned all the way up on that one. I'm sure the city council is gonna have a chat about that. I'm not against businesses having signage. And I do think that this is an evolving area. So I hope that we revisit this periodically. I don't want to do it right now. That's a Pandora's box. I just encourage us to be aware. I mean, I think in the name of trying to help businesses advertise where they are, that we can find forward-thinking ways to do that just don't feel like we're cluttering and, I just hate saying no to everything. Let's just, but anyway, just as you guys see things, I think you'll see things at conferences and other places and please, as we examine how ordinances are written in other places around the country, I'd love to see us be, I don't like us just saying no, or just, we need to keep it like little baby size. I think we could be more nuanced.
I think you'll continue to see probably a text edit from the same code every time we come.
Awesome.
It's a really hard code.
Yeah.
It was written a long time ago when signage product was different. And quite honestly, there's conflicting parts in it. So it seems like most times we do one of these, we're touching part of it, which maybe at one point it merits a full overhaul. These are kind of meant to be gap stop efforts to just make the code better bit by bit. But yeah, it is a vendor's box.
We got a lot of irons in the fire right now in the city.
Can
so-
I kind of just recap the changes I heard here on this one before we move on to Ian's? Sounds like the changes we have consensus around making are phrasing the terminology, the definition here as a place of worship, and then specifying that where it calls that out as allowed, it would be a property where the primary function is as a place of worship. Does that sound right to everybody?
Does that equate to over 51%? Is that
Um,
primary?
I mean.
I guess if we're qualifying this,
Yeah, we don't super have like an exact metric for primary and secondary. Usually our code just says if it's like an ancillary use. We do that often by square footage, but there's not in our code a specific amount. So, I would recommend just stating it that way, and I think it would cover it. I don't foresee issue, but if you want to put a metric to it, definitely within your purview. Okay, great. So I think that's the two I have. Ian did the heavy lifting on this one, so I'm gonna slide my computer over to you, and I've got the mouse hooked up for easy use.
So the third proposed change that we're bringing to you is lighting for recreation facilities. So when we adopted the outdoor lighting ordinance in 2019, it contained an exception section, which was designed to address instances where certain uses and circumstances might need some supplementary regulation. That other than just the standard regulations for lighting that would be applied to our commercial and residential zones. Because the section is titled exceptions and it has a kind of a description under here of what the intent of the chapter is, it's led to a bit of confusion with some applicants. They're kind of under the impression that any item listed under this section, you can see there's 6 or 7 of them. That anything under this section is accepted from any regulation in the chapter, which is not the case. So we're proposing to rename this section to supplementary lighting provisions and clarify specifically within this section that that only public and commercial outdoor recreational facilities are meant to be included here. So right now what we have is the section is titled exceptions, and the second item is outdoor athletic and recreational facilities. And it gives people some more regulations regarding those facilities, but I think the intent is for this to only apply to public and commercial outdoor recreation facilities like courts or fields.
In practice, we've had some building permit applicants, well before the pickleball topic came up, come to us and say, I'm building just a, basketball court in my yard. I want to do these big stadium lights on it, these really bright. I see that there's something here for outdoor athletic and recreational facilities, so I don't have to follow the code.
Yeah.
When this was written, it was meant to apply to places like the rec center, Brighton High, like more commercial or public ones, not private, but
yeah,
because it didn't say that, we had some pushback, so that's kind of what this is meant to close the loop.
Do you guys have any questions about this?
So the new ordinance in discussion, this is not applicable to that. Okay.
It comes up because someone who's building a sport court will often ask, what's the lighting regulations? And we say, here's the ordinance. Sometimes people read this and say, okay, well, I'm gonna play that card and say, this is
And now
that.
it's an
And I don't
outdoor
have to-
athletic thing. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
That was my question.
Okay. Just move on to the next one then. The fourth change that we're bringing you is some accessory building fixes. These are really miscellaneous. They're kind of all over the place. Right now, city code currently defines accessory buildings as both being possibly attached to and detached from primary structures, which is kind of bizarre. Like you'd think an accessory structure is its own structure. And we've always treated anything attached to the primary structure as part of the primary structure. So this has led to a lot of confusion since we all treat accessory buildings as completely detached. So we're just proposing to make that change in the definition of an accessory building, that accessory buildings are always detached from the either residential primary structure, or if it's in a commercial zone, the primary business structure. Along with some additional changes, like you can see here in the definition of accessory building. We're clarifying that an accessory building is one that does not exceed 70% of the floor area of the main structure. Currently, we just have the phrase, the building area must be significantly less than that of the main structure, which has sometimes led to confusion, and this has always been our interpretation, but it's good to put that in code.
I will say accessory dwelling units are separate from this, so
Yeah.
you could still have an accessory dwelling unit that is detached, but as far as accessory building, shed, a garage, that is detached. If it's attached to the home, it might have a different function than the home, but it is just an addition to your home for
Oh.
setbacks.
I have a question on the floor area. So if your main level of your home is 1,200 square feet and your basement's 1,000, so you're 2,200 square feet. So is it that based on that calculation,
It is.
not just like the main floor?
Square
Correct.
footage.
Not just
The
the
total
footprint.
square footage? Okay.
Yeah. And that's the same wording that we find in our the definition of an accessory building for a business or industry. So we kind of copied that format over to the residential definition
We
for an
wanted
accessory
to
building.
give people some flexibility to have a bigger detached space if they needed it for hobby purposes, but also there is still kind of a metric that keeps it from growing maybe excessively large, in that accessory buildings can only take up 25% of their rear yard.
And then kind of in line with this change, we also are proposing to change the definition of what we currently call a private garage to a detached garage. And then also removing kind of a redundant definition of garage / accessory dwelling, which was probably carried over from when we were part of Salt Lake County, considering that we now treat ADUs completely separately.
Does this have any conflict to accessory dwelling units? Because I believe the state code on this has accessory dwelling units as mother-in-law apartments attached as well as detached. Is there any
That's
conflict in
just a
that?
separate ordinance, so it would be treated differently, where it would allow them to be detached or attached.
Just shares a common
The-
word is the only.
The state code though only requires us to permit by right internal ADUs. So detached ADUs may be defined in state code. That's not part of the state's requirement that cities have to allow them.
And
Quick
removing that
question.
definition doesn't like remove the allowance of that at all, but.
If I'm in rural residential and I have a barn, the barn may be greater than the square footage of the home. And in that situation, it probably makes sense that it would be. This would prohibit it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and it technically does today as well, because the code does read it has to be significantly less. So
So that would be a new definition that we'd be adding.
this just puts an actual percentage to what significantly less is.
Just seems like in some zones. And it seems like I remember when we enacted this, but. In some zones, significantly less makes less sense.
Sure, I guess what I would say is this is consistent with how it has been written always, just trying to put a metric to what significantly less is.
Not always, but.
But it's just in recent history, I think if you wanted to look at changing that to where accessory buildings in those rural zones could be larger, you could look at that. It just would be a different direction than where the code has been more recently, so.
To me, the size really is about coverage more than it is about comparison to the primary structure, but. You have a 5-acre lot and a 1,200 square foot home.
Well, if you will
Barn.
probably recall a brightly colored garage structure that we dealt with. And that was an interesting, it was a large lot with a small older home and they constructed a very large detached garage and kind of went through this exercise. And this is a lot of language that was in place at the time and it was very confusing. So that, Trying to
what
clean
is
that
the
up a little bit.
rationale for the 70%? And why couldn't you have, if you have 2 or 3 acres, why couldn't you build a barn or a garage or a workshop that's bigger than your?
I would guess
Square footage?
that
I don't
the
understand
intent,
the rationale.
it's typical to what I've seen from a lot of codes. I would guess that the intent in having it, which again exists in our code today, it just doesn't have a percentage to it, would be probably for the property to appear as residential, single family as its primary function. So to your point, certainly on some properties where the barn is way the heck out there behind the home and no one sees it, it might make less sense. But codes don't really take kindly to one-off situations. You know, it's like they want to put down a metric for this is what it is. So it may make less practical sense in some of those areas. I think that's probably the intent for why it was written in originally.
For me, though, the metric you use to solve that problem is lot coverage, not the square footage of the primary.
Yeah, it's always, it's about accessory, secondary and incidental, and the code has decided that part of that definition means not only you use it less than the primary use on the lot, but it is physically secondary to and smaller.
If the commission feels that that part should be removed, I mean, you also can make a recommendation that way. I don't think there's anything that says it has to be in there. The approach tonight was saying, okay, our code has said it needs to be significantly less. We run into issues every time with telling people what that means.
So we've had situations where we've had, I mean, we know there are violations of this all over the city. And typically they're on small lots where you've got somebody that put a massive structure, right? Is like maxing it out all the way around. That's, I think, what we're trying to prohibit is stuff like that. I mean, can we put like a basement in terms of like the minimum size that, you know, that this applies to lots that are lots must be over a certain size, you know, over 1 acre. 'Cause I like the idea that if you've got the space and somebody just wants to put a barn out there in the back 40, you know, we're not talking about more than probably 2 or 3% of Cottonwood Heights in reality, right? I mean, we're not talking about everybody here. But the problem, the reason for the code is that we've got people that are on postage stamp size lots that max out a secondary garage for a workshop that goes right up every dimension they possibly can and maxing it out. And it's created problems. I mean, not like a few, like this isn't like a one-off. So in my mind, I'm like, on the one side, you know, if we're gonna restrict it, I'm not married to the percentage of the lot, but I do think that if you don't have the space, you don't have the space. If you bought a X size lot, you know, that's just not realistic to be able to put a secondary structure on there.
So I think the way that we get around that is what Mike had recommended is rural residential, you know, there's not the exception of the square footage of the home, but it is the 25%. And I think that's how we qualify that. Is that what you propose?
I think that would deal with
I
the
think that
concern
makes
that
a
I
lot of
have.
sense.
Write that in here, just say, let's see, where am I reading? It does not exceed 70% of the floor area of the main structure, except those in rural residential zones.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind for me is that we're then regulating accessory buildings just in the definitions chapter when we have supplementary and qualifying provisions that do regulate accessory buildings. So maybe we want to locate that there instead, but.
Yeah, I think if we know what direction you guys want to go, we can figure out what sections it needs to go in. Totally fine.
Are we unified that it's like, if they've got enough space, let's, you know, let's not get crazy about
The
it.
sentiment is just in rural residential zones, just stick with the 25% rear yard lot coverage. And then this would apply to
Other.
residential zones, your R1 zones.
Because that qualifies your 2 to 3% is rural residential, which is primarily down off of Creek.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can make that change.
Awesome.
Works for us.
Thanks, guys.
We're just excited to be able to tell somebody what significantly less. I know it's just like a torturous question we give new planners, like, hey, can you figure out what this means? Because none of us can. What is significantly less?
Can you build a church? To 70%?
I will say we get a lot of our interview questions from actual circumstances.
All right, so another weird question related to this, but can you build more than one accessory building?
You
So
can.
you could just stamp 4 of them out up to 25% of lot coverage anywhere, right?
Yeah, there has to be certain setback between each of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, we see people all the time who will have a couple of sheds, maybe they have a detached garage, very common, and we just say, those things combined, you can't cover more than X amount of the rear yard and X amount of the whole lot. So very common, especially with larger properties.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the properties in Cumberland Heights?
I also-
Yeah.
We could tell you
Depends.
very easily. I wouldn't be able to guess off the top of my head, but
For residential.
No, just, I'm
Half
wondering
acre.
how many are bigger than half acre. In my neighborhood, half acre is the standard, I think. and
Yeah.
Some are a full acre.
some are less than a half acre.
Yeah.
Some are slightly less.
Yeah.
But,
Most of them.
but I'm thinking of a neighbor who has a really nice full acre lot. And this is applicable to her. She's.
Yeah.
Some changes. Her house is probably less than 2,000 square feet, but I think she has an accessory unit
Sure.
that she plans on using maybe primarily, and it's gonna be bigger than that, but she's got room and won't aside from that.
Yeah.
And I have other neighbors who have a half acre who have really filled it up pretty well.
I will say the most common zone is R18, 8,000 square foot minimum. So it's not a lot of properties, especially those who aren't required to have a half acre anymore. A lot of them are smaller, but if you're interested, we could give you an actual number from our GIS department.
Just curious.
Another way at it to deal with that is not just go rural residential, but anything. Any of the zones less than certain square footage. So the zone off of Creek is not R18. I
It
don't
would be
know.
RR121, so rural residential.
Half acre is the smallest RR zone, and then it goes
Okay.
down to R1
So
suite.
it is.
I think RR is actually a really good way to do it,
That's smart.
rural residential.
I don't know.
The question is, could you add the RR125 to the same exception of 25%, or is that?
Yeah, so I think the way I'm hearing you guys is the 25%, but not the 70% would apply in any of the rural residential. And that would include the RR121 down by Commissioner Smith.
That'd be half acre, full acre zoning, basically half acre and up.
That's great.
So I think it actually is a great idea to do that.
Covers it.
Yeah.
So.
I was confused, thank you.
So I'm just trying to think about like what this might look like and what the extreme could be on that end. 25% of a 2 acre lot or a 1.5 acre lot, it's rather large. Like, is there a point where there should be a limit? It's just a different graduated limit. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, up to 25,000 square feet.
It's just in the yard.
The building might be out of control.
25% of the rear yard, not the whole lot.
Mhm.
So it
Still though,
would
if you have one of those small rural houses, little cottages, right, that just right up on the road. And then we're taking 25% of the rest. I'm just saying, you could put a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I
You have
think
5 acres
I
and
think
that's.
a lot of times it's financially just not practical for people to do it. We don't see even a lot of proposals for it.
You'd probably see people upgrade their house first, but I'm
Yeah.
saying like you guys are the ones that are gonna find the exception, right?
Yeah, I
I
wouldn't
didn't know if there's a
be
reasonable,
too worried about it, but if you guys want to build something in, you can. I've never seen a proposal for that, but who knows? Maybe someone out there would.
Oh, wants to build a half acre barn.
Yeah.
We
okay.
do have one, I mean, I can think of one, somebody that I know that has that's been here for an enormous number of years that has horses on his property, and he has a number of outbuildings. They're all highly functional for what he does. And the primary living structure is very, very small,
Mhm.
but he complains vehemently about the taxes because it's the square footage of all these buildings. So there are some self-limiters there that, I mean, I think, he beats me up periodically about what would it take to subdivide his property. I'm like, I am not the guy to talk to about that. So, I mean, there may be some other natural caps with some of the features too.
So do you want to just be cognizant of your time? We're at 5:42 right now. If you guys still want to go through town center stuff, I would suggest maybe we move on to the final change. And then if there's more discussion on this, which I think there should be, if you have more comments, we can do it in the business meeting as well.
Jess, do you want to keep pursuing that, or are you good?
I just thrown it out there, because I
Yeah.
think we were taking a one.
Finger on the pulse, are we okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
If anyone feels otherwise, by all means, we can continue discussing in the business session. Just don't want to leave you without any time to talk about the much anticipated town center.
So I'll just quickly go through the final proposed change. I'm gonna skip past this section. It's also included in the final change. That pretty much just addresses detached ADUs, which is the point of this change. So unlike other accessory buildings, our detached ADUs are subject to stricter setback standards. So right now, we require detached ADUs to meet the same setback standards as primary structures. in residential zones while also being located in the rear yard behind those primary structures. So if you're building a detached ADU in an R18 zone, it's gotta meet, the primary structures setbacks, but it's also gotta be 6 feet in the rear of that primary home. This has led to some confusion because someone will see the accessory building standards and think, oh my gosh, I can do a detached ADU. I only have to be 3 feet from the property line, and I'm sure they've got to be 20 feet if they're in the R18 zone. So that comes up a lot when we have meetings with potential applicants, and it's a big surprise. So we're wanting to make sure that this is clear in the ADU chapter for people that do read our code before meeting with staff. And in our supplementary and qualifying provisions section for accessory building area regulations. So in our accessory dwelling unit chapter, the change that we're proposing to make, there's a lot of content. It's at the very end here. Detached ADUs shall be subject to the additional following development standards. Any detached ADU located in the rear yard of a property shall maintain a setback of at least 6 feet behind the primary structure. And then any detached ADU shall be subject to primary structure side and rear setback standards for the zone which it is located.
And this, I'll just reiterate, is not different from the requirements today. We're just trying to make those more clearly visible in the code because it is easily missed.
Yeah, I think it's only in like one spot where it lists that requirement. So
One thing might be really hard, but it would be helpful, which is if you didn't call them accessory buildings, if you had some other word than accessory, then people would be less likely. to
Yeah,
conflict there. So
yeah, that's.
if that's possible, you should think about changing that
That's a good
accessory word.
thing to kind of put on the idea board.
Yeah, just if there's a better terminology for it, that's a great point.
It is.
yeah. And then the only other change we're proposing to make as part of this chapter, again, this was included in the last as well, so I'm not just skimming over that. Is in our supplementary and qualifying provisions chapter, the part that addresses accessory buildings. To just state minimum yard area requirements for accessory buildings are as follows, unless otherwise expressly permitted in an underlying zone. No accessory building shall be located in a front, side, or corner side yard area of a lot, including a detached ADU. So just clarifying that detached ADUs have to be located in the rear yard, but that also.
So the no is not struck out.
It's.
I think that's an error.
It appeared, okay, 'cause
Yeah.
when I saw it, it
Probably
appeared to me
Use
that.
lowercase.
Yeah. We'll clean that up. We'll add the lowercase in, sure, but yeah, that was an error.
This is also meant to address, in the rural residential zones, you can have a detached structure in the front yard if it meets certain setbacks. So we wanted
Yes,
to update
yes.
this language to be more inclusive of that. Because technically that would be a conflict as written today.
So that's why it says unless otherwise expressly permitted in an underlying zone, because some zone chapters do permit it. So it's adding that provision, because right now it just says no accessory building can be located in front yard, which isn't true. So
So-
we're correcting that provision.
So in practice with the setbacks, it has to be 6 feet off of the building itself.
Yes.
And then 20 feet off of the back.
That's
For an
correct.
property-
accessory
for
dwelling.
accessory. So 20 feet off of the back
8 and 10 on the sides.
and 8 and 10 on the side.
Well.
So that, from the intent of, and I've read the ADU, state code on this, which is interesting.
Mhm.
That basically disqualifies most homes for allowing ADUs.
Yeah.
Detached.
For detached ADUs.
So I would say it's a really big conversation. The gist of it is that Cottonwood Heights was not required to allow detached ADUs at all. They were only required to allow internal ones by state code. The community does not have to allow detached. And the council at the time of adoption felt like we want to allow detached ones, but we're not totally comfortable with them being maybe everywhere. So they put those guardrails on it. So that was a political decision made at that time.
And I'll just also add that like an internal ADU could also be an addition onto like
Yes,
an existing home.
yeah, as long as it meets the main home setbacks.
Yeah. The only other line that we're proposing to change is any detached ADU shall maintain a setback of at least 6 feet from the main building, again, in the rear yard of the property, and subject to all primary structure setback standards for the zone in which it is located. So we're trying to make that very
I put it
clear.
everywhere.
Yeah,
Because it really is confusing if you read the accessory building chapter, you think you get your setbacks, you come in all excited to do your ADU, and we have to say, we're so sorry. This is it. So just try to make it more clear.
Any concerns there? Okay, thanks, guys.
Way to go again.
way to go, Samantha.
You had the hard ones this time. You took the technical ones. Great, let me stop sharing so we can turn you over. It looks like you're at 5:48, so you still have hopefully enough time to answer any of your questions about town center.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just want to make sure the commission's aware of how this project is moving on. Obviously, Commissioner Mills is on the advisory committee for that as well, so he's well aware. We had the 2 town hall meetings in January, so many of you at those. They are, let's bring this up. We have a project website that's just, chTownCenter.com. And this website was just created as kind of the home base for project updates as we move throughout it. 2 things to highlight right now. We have a public survey available here. We have, I think, almost 200 responses so far and just started advertising this widely in the newsletter and places like that. So certainly, pass that along and take that survey if you're interested. And then we have the recordings from those town hall public forums uploaded onto this website as well. And that was the intent or the emphasis of the project in January was let's do some preliminary public comment before any concepts or ideas are generated. Let's see what the wider public thinks and what ideas are out there. There's very beneficial. I think the community room was full on both of those nights. We had all the chairs that the city owns out and they were full, standing room only. So it was really encouraging to see that.
I was selling chairs out front.
The next steps, we have the Town Center Advisory Committee, which is the resident committee that was appointed to help kind of make recommendations and help convey the desires and the thoughts of the public to the city and to the project team. And then we have the consulting group that was contracted to help do the technical, the planning, the larger public engagement opportunities. There's developers and surveyors and engineers as part of that group. So kind of the technical analysis side and the actual preparing of the plans that come out of that. We are planning to meet with both groups again here at the end of February. And at that point, we'll start generating concept plans based on the public input, based on previous surveys, based on master plans, a number of factors. We'll generate multiple site plan concepts for the site. And the idea is to use those site plans to then start to get a good sense of, okay, if we like this plan, here's the pros, here's the cons, here's the potential cost implications, here's all the things that everyone should be aware of trying to implement a concept like that one. And then share that again with the public. And the idea there is to just be in that cycle and whittle down and add detail and flesh it out until we land at a preferred concept. So I would expect to see more wider public engagement, probably, late March, April, kind of spring timeline, because we'll have to meet and then it'll take some time to generate those design concepts. And in the meantime, we'll continue to send out updates and make sure everyone that wants updates on them can get them. You can submit comments and feedback through this project website that gets to the project team and the advisory committee. And again, we'll continue updating this. I think we're working on right now a summary document of the general comments we heard at the town hall meetings. It's a 1-page document, so you don't have to watch 4 hours of YouTube videos that, will try to express the general themes of what was heard. And that's my update. Commissioner Mills, do you have anything else?
I would just add, the public was really, as somebody made the comment of all the public meetings that they ever attended, it was the most diplomatic and kind that people have been to one another, to the committee, to the
Lovely.
staff, to the process. They're very little paranoia and more just enthusiasm and embracing that this can be something that will be good. It was interesting. If you do have a chance, and you want a better understanding, there is a range of what the residents said from like the housing issue. There are people that want no housing. There are people that want high density housing. There are people that want to max out the space. There are people that want it to be no higher than 2 stories. There are people that want it tiered. There are people that want it flat. There are people that want underground parking. There are people that are like not opposed to keeping some form of surface parking. There are people that wanted to have it completely paid for, that there are no tax dollars spent. There are people that see it as amenity where maybe some tax dollars, if it's something that people would like, and people would like is extremely vague right now. So, and how much in terms of the committee has no idea how much things will cost. But there is a lot of aspirational ideas. Generally speaking, they are, coming around the idea of something like a gathering space of some type in the middle. Some things that will generate revenue around the outside, whatever that is, not too tall, but some portion of it may be higher than the rest of it. Probably level and probably with underground parking, understanding that that makes the math extremely complicated in order to make that work. And I keep hitting the button that we want to make sure that form-based code meshes nicely with this so that we can put the right guardrails on it. So it's undecided. I would listen to it regularly because I think it will inform what you're gonna say in terms of form-based code, and staff have been good about asking for our feedback on this. And if you're worried that, okay, I don't know exactly what I want to say about especially that area, listening to the comments will be helpful. And it's, you know, it's a really good range. It's a really healthy conversation, and something you will listen to with your planning commission hat and say, there's no way we can do that. And you'll know right out of the chute. And other things where you'll say, I've not thought of that before. And then you'll hear it like 3 more times and say, wow, okay, that's enough people that it's like, maybe we ought to consider that. Nobody on this advisory committee has an agenda. Nobody has decided exactly what they want. And from our process, we listened to 5-minute presentations last night from one another. The groups are you know, coalescing into 3 separate groups, and the 3 groups are going to try to come up, you know, get the ideas to kind of come together around 3 ideas that will be shared with staff, not with the intent that it's like they must do this. It's like, it's more kind of like some bubbles of maybe we could do something like this, and here's some features that ought to be considered, or, you know, that kind of bubbled up. And the combination of our discussion, our interaction with residents from our individual districts, Randy Whitehead and the mayor and Ellen Burrell took a trip to Indiana, to a city that's won all sorts of awards, and a mayor that is known for being a huge advocate for business and economic development, but also making these cool spaces and turned it from a really, really nasty looking suburb of Indianapolis into like a place that people in Indianapolis drive out to. So there's some places that are doing some cool things. So there's a lot of, these are really, really good things to get involved with. And with your planning commission hat on, I'd encourage you to be familiar with the website and be familiar with what the resident comments have been. I think you'll inform other things that we do here, to be honest, too. And again, the range of comments and the diplomacy that people approach it was really admirable. So
What requirement does the city have from bonds and taxing to abide to, because they made the acquisition?
Yep.
Is there any state guidelines that are requiring them one way or another?
Well, they use sales tax bonds to purchase the property, so those will need to be paid back over a period of time, and that's, you know, a financial technical thing. But that's a city council decision of what does the return on this look like and what tools are out there to offset the cost. It is a community reinvestment area, so the idea is to pursue tax increment financing once we have a plan together to help offset the costs of infrastructure and other portions of that development. There are grants, there's other ideas out there. Our hope is that as we have concepts put together, then we can start to generate, you know, those revenue projections of what's the cost of development, what's the return, how does this factor in, and then the council will have the tools to make those decisions.
Seems like the consultants just need a little more direction from the committee and residents before they can do the pro formas on it. So it's like, that'll be really exciting when we get to that.
And I don't want to speak for the council, so, you know, they may have their own personal thoughts.
Yeah.
Certainly welcome to reach out and ask them.
And Sean, it's an N of 1, but Randy has the kind of the TIF structure a little bit of at what point is the ROI becomes significant in terms of what you buy it at and what you need to, how well it needs to perform. So there, some of that legwork, again, that's Indiana. It's not Salt Lake City, Utah. So we don't know if the math transfers as well, but it's out there. So, I mean, if Randy Whitehead's super approachable, he would spend time with any one of you if you're interested. And I've been impressed by Randy, despite the fact that he is a backdoor neighbor to this property. He is pretty open, with the exception of like putting a high rise right in his backyard. So anything short of that, I'm pretty open to. And, you know, and even then, I watched him listen to people talking about going high on different parts of the property. And I know his feeling, and he was very diplomatic about maybe there's a way that we could do it. You know, it wasn't like a, you know, anyway.
Maybe I'll send out the project website to everybody, just a little reminder to click on it, and then if I can make an ask, you could just like share with your neighbors to take the survey. I feel like you guys are all very involved in your community, and so if you can get the word out. We love seeing the survey results roll in, it's really helpful, and we acknowledge that not everyone can come to the public open houses with scheduling conflicts, so the survey is a great way to give that same feedback.
We have a minute left. Commissioner Anderson reached out to me earlier and listened to the council work session last night about the sport court ordinance.
Yes.
Wondered if she could have a minute to just update the commission on that.
Right below.
I'll go below,
Little-
yeah.
there you go.
There you go.
There you go.
Thanks. Yes, I listened into the work session last night. Mike did a great job presenting, our thoughts on how the 500 square foot non-building thing should go. I don't know what we have it named now, but did a great job, and the council was very appreciative of the work that the planning commission did in collaborating and the time spent in coming to this idea of what this ordinance should look like. I would say that there was agreement and consensus by the council on the direction that we ended up with at our last meeting, but I just think it's really important that they were very glowingly praising our work and the fact that we came together with an ordinance that we were all happy with, so.
Way to
just wanted to share
go.
that.
Thank
So,
you for that. That was, I mean, the discussions I've been involved with this commission over the years, I'm very proud of that, because I think we all had some thoughts going into it, and at different points, I watched every single person set aside their personal thoughts for a moment, including staff, and the ability to be a little malleable. And again, I mentioned that last time, good governance. I'm glad to see that transferred to them. That's great.
yeah, they
Thanks
were
for
very.
tuning in.
Thanks for sharing
Yeah,
that. See,
That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
do you,
I agree. I again want to shout out Sam's voice of Zoom at the last meeting for saying, hey, you guys are talking about nuisances, go that direction.
yeah, that was
I think
awesome.
that was.
That was
that was
the
a pivot point,
Let me give that credit.
the voice from above. That's great.
Absolutely.
Something about being home in my sweatpants. I agree.
Doing her best
Good
work.
job.
You're the pattern for that.
Okay, I just sent you all the links to the website, so.
Okay, anything else we need to consider for the work session?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to
Everybody.
adjourn.
It
Second.
was first by Commissioner Chapel for the minute.
All those in favor of motion to adjourn, say aye.
Aye.
I.
We are adjourned.
And I put that on this.